Now we're looking at the distinctiveness of Greek culture and the conditions under which the Western conversation of philosophy and science that brings us to our own civilization got started. Last time we looked at the cultural context of that, the life of Athens, the politics of the Athenian polis, its evolution, its culture, the sense of the people. And as we'll see, as we begin to read Plato and Aristotle, their vision of political economy, their vision of the state and society is not something they invented as a matter of pure philosophy. It grows out of the ideals of the polis, and in some ways it's a critique of the polis. But it's very much involved in their culture. No philosopher escapes his culture. No philosopher escapes the contexts of his or her times. And so to just look and understand what Plato and Aristotle were doing and how they set the stage for Western thought, we have to understand that they were part of and also an expression of the life of the Greek community. But today we're going to see that they were also an expression of Greek thought, and that these theories, the theories of Plato and Aristotle, which in a sense have come down to us and which represent a heritage that we still read and remember, were in fact an episode, some might say a culmination, of a long pattern of intellectual development. And we want to trace that pattern of intellectual development today and see how Greece, in effect, discovered philosophy. In doing that, we're watching the human mind at work. And you'll see that some of the stages are primitive and terribly awkward. And you'll see a process of inquiry in a civilization that looks an awful lot like the process of inquiry in your own mind when you're beginning to explore, almost childishly, questions that you've never asked or never thought of before. Now, if we go back in time, the thought, the view of the universe, the philosophy of the Greeks really parallels that of the ancient civilizations that we talked about last week, Egypt, Mesopotamia, ancient Israel. And Greek philosophy is not born overnight. The Greeks are not distinctive. At the time when the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians thought in terms of a world inhabited by gods and spirits, what we've come to call a mythopoetic world, so did the Greeks. Because if you go back and look at Greek thought, between 1200 and 800, or sometime in the Dorian period, you see that they were very similar in their outlook on life to other ancient civilizations. Nature and society were very much an undifferentiated realm. Society and politics were what the gods willed. And the gods were both natural forces, and they were at the same time acting, willing beings. So that in the person of Demeter, for example, some of you who've been with Future Farmers of America or groups like that might have encountered the group called the Daughters of Demeter. We keep borrowing these Greek things, bringing them down to our time. But Demeter is the goddess of fertility. Well, what is she exactly? It's hard to explain. In a sense, you think of a god in the sky that creates fertility. But she's also the force of fertility in the world. So in a way, Demeter acting is a kind of scientific explanation of how fertility works, of how crops grow, of how things live and regenerate themselves, and so forth. And in a way, the ancient Greeks, like all of their sister ancient civilizations, created their science, in effect, their explanation of the way the world worked, out of the actions of these gods who were both supernatural beings that existed outside of the realm of the actual and the observable, but also they were the actual and observable. That was how they explained force and motion and change in the universe. Now, by the time of the beginnings of the Greek city-states, by 800 BC or so, and the time of Homer, the Greek view of the cosmos had become, in a way, political. The gods formed a council or a legislature. They engaged in political acts of conflict and deliberation. Zeus, as the sky god, was the head of the council of gods. And in some ways, what the Greeks had evolved, and really this is almost a second stage of Greek thought, was something like the Mesopotamian mythology. Well, what you're dealing with here is an evolution of thought. What they needed was a unifying concept. They had, out of their own mythology, out of their own folklore, all of these different gods and all of these different forces. But the human inquiring mind was sort of asking, what does it all add up to? In a way, what is the unifying theory behind it? And I think you begin to see evolving this political view of the actions of the gods as a way of creating a unifying theory. Now you see this most forcefully in the work of Homer. And in Homer, in fact, you see Greek thought in a way becoming codified, written down. I know it's an odd thing to say, but the recounting of the acts of the god in the Homeric legends, we might say, was a strange mythopoetic form of a scientific textbook. It told you what the different gods did, how they worked together, what their actions were. It was, you might sort of kind of a unified field theory of 800 BC. And in doing this, Greece began to become self-conscious and to codify the thought of its own civilization. Note the date, 800 BC. This is about the same time when the ancient Hebrews are pulling together their mythology and their thought in the Torah, or Pentateuch, and in the Deuteronomic Code, in what the Christian world today calls the Old Testament. Now, those of you who are working with the Homeric legends and other ILS courses know this is still a fairly inchoate view of the universe. And there's something about the rationality of the Greek mind that is never satisfied with things that don't add up, that don't make sense. So you see a further evolution in mythology in the works of Hesiod, which come just a little later, in which, in a way, you are formalizing or creating a more natural mythology. An epic, in a sense, you might say, in which you de-romanticize the gods. You try to systematize and make the pattern more logical. And then you begin to see this carrying over into Greek literature, into Greek tragedy, through the Golden Age. In all the Greek plays, in all the Greek tragedies, you see a sense of great underlying forces that propel the characters along. We not only have the mythology of action and being of kings and heroes and gods, but they're driven to do the things that they do. They meet their fate. The great theme of tragedy is sort of the inevitability of that tragedy. And so the Greeks, even in their literature, are beginning to suspect that behind the actions of the gods, apart from the actions of these being willing gods, there are forces at work in nature that are abstract and impersonal. And you begin to talk about fortune and fate in terms of human beings. People are driven to their destiny by forces over which they have no control, which they do not will. Now, all of these things are in the background. And in the background of the Greek mind, as you begin to approach the age of philosophy, and it's really in a period of political change, the rise of the polis, the rise of Ionian or Attic civilization, the rise of the islands and the peninsula over the highlands and the mountains of the Dorian areas of Greece, that you begin to see the decline of myths as the living culture of Greek thought, and the beginning of speculative philosophy, the beginning of the life of the mind, so that the people, and I think by the time you reach Athens in the Golden Age, you're saying even quite ordinary people, no longer explain the world. Well, they do. They're still in transition because, as you'll see when you read the Republic, there's still a lot of discussion of the myths, the religion, the will of the gods, and so on. But you're beginning to think about the world in very different terms than explaining the world because of the actions of certain gods, telling stories, telling narratives, explaining the world to your children in terms of the actions of the gods. And so you begin to see the beginning of what we would call philosophy, speculation, the life of the intellect, rather than the life of folklore and myth as the way of organizing one's thought about the universe. And it happens somewhere between 530 and 580 BC. And as far as we know, it happens at different points in Greece, but we don't know where in all of the cases. But we do know that the first recorded sparks of this transformation occur on the island of Miletos in the east, in the Aegean Sea, somewhat east of Athens. Now, to see how Greek philosophy began, and you almost have to put yourself in the mind of people wondering about the universe in a new way for the first time, people who'd never thought this way before. It's useful to sort of see some central problems or some central ideas, characteristics that are simply embedded in the way the Greeks thought of the world. We might call these sort of the underlying propositions or the underlying premises of the Greek mythopoetic world. The same way that in terms of Greek values, the values of arete, virtue, excellence, goodness, dike, justice, harmony, organize their thoughts. So there are certain thoughts that organize the way the Greeks saw natural order, or really just thought about things in general. And one of their underlying propositions, or thought forms, was that the world and the universe, the basic nature of the universe, was a perpetual contest between opposites. For example, they thought about the world in terms of the opposition of night and day. In words we wouldn't use, night drives out day, then day recovers and drives out night. Or one thinks about the opposition of hot and cold, and hot drives out cold, and cold drives out hot. Wet and dry are opposites in the same way, and one drives out the other. Now, we've got some sort of basic thought forms of the same kind. I mean, we think sometimes, I think we think a lot in equilibrium models, for example, that we think of the laws of supply and demand, the systems of checks and balances. Or we think causationally. Everything has to have a cause of some kind or another. Now, just as fundamental as our way of thinking that everything has to have a cause is this Greek sense that one understands things as a contest of opposites, polarities, two things. But in a way, this opposition of forces produced a natural disequilibrium in nature, a lack of harmony, a lack of balance. In the changing seasons, the cold and the wet season drives out the hot and the dry season in two-season Greece. And oddly, to the Greek mind, nature appeared less orderly than human affairs. See, with the evolving polis, with the evolving system of law, with the deep customs of the city-states, human affairs appeared dike. They appeared just, harmonious, orderly, planned, in comparison to nature. Nature looked kind of whimsical, random. Events happened. There was a lot of flux around. I guess you can even feel that if you look at nature today from a certain kind of Greek eye. I mean, just look out of a window and say, the works of man, from a certain point of view, are architectural and orderly. You look at a building and it's all squared up. But trees are kind of random. And the weather comes and goes, and especially in Wisconsin, it comes and goes at very fast intervals, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And so you begin to wonder, well, nature doesn't look like it's guided by laws as much as human life is. And in a sense, this bothered the Greeks, because there was something adikia, unjust, unharmonic, unnatural about the world of nature, and they felt this couldn't be right. Nature had to make sense, as human affairs made sense. And part of, I think, the quest of Greek philosophy was to try to make nature make sense, to try to find a reason underlying it, because their innate instinct was that nature was flux, nature was change, nature was constantly in process. And of course, they lived in such a hospitable part of the world in the Eastern Mediterranean that, you can't, considering what they didn't know about the forces of nature, this observation is very telling. It tells a great deal about the way their minds and what they observed, what they thought about before their minds were structured in any way. Now, very closely related to this is a second thought in the Greek mind, or a second question in the Greek mind, a question of paralyzing simplicity, but one that started the whole process of philosophic speculation that hasn't ended to the present day. And the simple question is this: what is appearance and what is reality? What is illusion and what is real? And the thought that occurred to the Greeks may never have occurred to you before, and I want to introduce it to you because for the rest of this year, you have to be so sure of it to understand the rest of the story. You have to be able to see this. So let me just kind of take you through this in a number of ways. You look around this room, and your Western scientific mind teaches you that there are a lot of real objects in it. The desk is perfectly real. See, this is good Anglo-American empiricism. If you can see it, you can observe it, you can test it, it exists. Now that's the scientific mind frame if I've ever seen it. The only thing that scares our society are things that can't be tested. So if you ask me, is there a table here? And I say, I doubt that there's a table here. And you say, you stupid fool, look, I can walk right up here and I can feel this, and that baby is there. That's real. And you look at yourself and you say, I am real. I exist. I get up in the morning, I look in the mirror, and there is something there. I pinch myself and I feel it. I am absolutely sure that I exist. Now, don't go home and worry about this too much, but you know that, right? And you look out the window and you say, that is a tree. And if I asked you, is that tree real? You'd say, oh, come on now. That's just a silly question. Okay, now, let me put this a little different way. The Greeks, somewhere on Miletos, looked at this world and said, but it might have been otherwise. That it was not necessary to the order of the universe that there be a table sitting there. It wasn't essential to the way things had to be organized in nature that green things called trees exist. If you look around this room, there are a lot of people who look very differently. You are not necessary. Not in the sense that you are dispensable, but you are not necessary in the sense that you might have been otherwise. Now, this sense that everything we see, that we of our scientific mind are so sure is what's permanent, what's true, what really counts are the things we can see, measure, test that exist in the world, that those are the things that you can't be sure about at all. That was the fundamental thing that unsettled the Greek speculative mind. People looked at a river and, of course, asked the question, can you step in the same river twice? Which was a way of expressing that same thing. Famous paradox of Greek thought. You look at a river and you say, well, I step in the river, yes, I step out. Thing keeps flowing. Can you step in it again? Is it the same river or is it a different river? Is the river real? Is the river permanent? Or has the river changed? And if the river has changed, what is it that's changed? You're going to change. I look at you now and I say, you are permanent, you are real. Yes, but what are you now? You're 18, 20 years old. You're a certain kind of person. You're going to be a very different kind of person 5 years from now. Which one is really you? Which one is really you? There might be a different you out there. Think about it. Sometimes you get up in the morning and you say, I'm not myself today. What on earth can you mean by that? You might be somebody different. All right, now think about this. If you're beginning to think this way, you're beginning to think the first thoughts that the Greeks had to think to worry philosophically. Because if everything in the world you saw could have been different, if these seats could have been different, if trees could have been different, if appearance might not be the same as reality, and contingency that which is contingent, that which is not necessary, if contingency does not equal necessity, if the things we see in the world could be otherwise, if you can imagine them otherwise, then that gives you a very uncomfortable feeling because you're not sure about anything. You don't know what exists and does not exist. You might wake up tomorrow morning and be an albatross. Things might change. And remember, these folks are very close to mythopoetic civilizations in which creatures did take their form, in which things metamorphosized, in which animals became spirits, became gods, became human beings, became plants, became animals. I mean, it's just a wonderful thing. We still exists in this world. I asked the university, requisitioned a sofa from the university for the Integrated Liberal Studies program the other day, and they sent back a computer, which was sort of a metamorphosis of material that approaches the mythopoetic in form. But they thought these things really occurred because they were very close to that kind of civilization, and in a way it upset them. So they began to ask the question, and this became the question that drove all philosophy, all science into our own times. What is real? What is true? What can we be sure of underlying the contingency, the accidental nature, the possible illusions of our sense experiences in the world? In over 2,000 years, as you'll say, we've debated that Greek question, what is real, what is illusion, over and over again in all sorts of various ways. And it raises the question then of an underlying reality, which is more permanent, more enduring, more real than appearances or solid things in this world themselves, more real than the objects that we observe and that make up the foundations and the fundamentals of our scientific knowledge. And they asked the question, was there something we could be sure of? Some sort of point of fixity in a universe of flux, some solid foundation on which we could build knowledge, a starting point from which we could be sure. Because only if we knew that would we have any ground to describe the universe, any ground to go on from there. Well, this is the setting of the problem of Greek speculation and philosophy. And their search then began. And it began with the search by asking the question, well, what is real, underlying appearances? And they began to ask this question, and out of this question, in the very vibrant period of Greek philosophy, came a variety of answers which in a strange way anticipate all the kinds of scientific theories we have today. Because all of our questions are really, all of our answers, all of our scientific theories are really extrapolations from conjectures, speculations that the Greeks made as to what the underlying nature of reality might be. Now, when you ask what is real underlying reality, what is fundamental, what is unchanging in a world of change, well, the first person to give an answer to that was a chap named Thales, a Milesian Greek, and his answer is going to be terribly disappointing to you. When asked what was the fundamental element underlying all reality, he answered, water. Oh my, what an answer to the question of the ages. But it was the first answer. And here was his argument, here was his reasoning. He said, well, water can become a solid, a liquid, or a gas. That's a pretty sophisticated observation for 600 BC. It is ubiquitous. He knew it existed in the human body. It can be combined with many solids. He knew that it existed in trees, for example, that it was based, and his observations were based both on observation in that sense and on speculation. Now, to understand Thales and why he thought water might be it, the basing point of everything, you also have to understand that the Greeks did not make a clear distinction between meteorology and astronomy. That in their initial formulation of astronomy, they conjectured that the heavens could have been like a sea or a vortex, that you could explain the movement of the heavenly bodies like objects in a sea or in a whirlpool. And that you knew there were clouds up in the sky, you knew rain fell from the air. The Greeks had a great capacity for common sense. If rain falls from the sky, if stars move around us in a vortex, why is not the world filled with water? Well, all right. It wasn't as bad an answer as it initially looks. At least it was an opening point, and Thales had his reasons. He gave you an argument as to why, quite possibly, everything arose from water, everything was made from water, that water was the fundamental element, and that water was the thing that would not change, no matter what else changed in the universe. Now, Anaximander, who was the successor to Thales, thought about Thales's theory. And all good science and all good philosophy really arises in criticism. You take off from somebody else's thought. The whole purpose in studying the philosophy of the West for a year, the best philosophy of the West, I suppose, is that you can take off from somebody else's thought and through criticism and analysis develop your own. And Anaximander really started that process by criticizing Thales. So even if Thales's idea doesn't strike you as very bright, at least it gave a foundation in which Anaximander could go further. Now, Anaximander's criticism doesn't strike you as terrific, because he argued that if water were the fundamental element, then everything in the world would finally return to this condition out of the opposition of forces, which he very much believed in. Cold and wet would eventually predominate over hot and dry, and the world would eventually be sort of swampy, wet. Everything would be water. Now, therefore, the basic matter must be something else. It doesn't, again, strike you as a good argument, but Anaximander said there's really no evidence to show that things return to the condition of water, that water is fundamental in that sense. And what Anaximander did, which was really to change the terms of the argument considerably, says, let's not look at anything in the world. Let's not look at the substances that we already observe, let's look behind them. And he said the underlying element, underlying reality, must be something more fundamental than matter itself. Any form of matter. He didn't say what it was, but he left it as an abstract postulate. But in doing that, he moved the Greek mind one step further to consider the idea that the problem wasn't to find which of the existing elements it was that was more fundamental than the rest, hot, cold, wet, dry, and all the rest of it, but to try to look behind and think a new thought. Well, that started the train a-moving. Parmenides, Zeno, and Anaxagoras, in various ways, began to postulate then that matter must be some elementary, tiny particle that we couldn't see, we couldn't even think about, that was combined through the operation of forces. Well, obviously what you have here was the first glimpse of the idea of the atom, and the first idea that all things that we see are built up from some more fundamental elements, and that these more fundamental elements combine because of forces and laws of their own nature. Okay, 530 BC, and they got it right. You know, they didn't see any atoms, they'd never seen an atom, but their theoretical approach was, at least from the point of view of physics and chemistry, one element of the correct answer. Underlying reality are not the things we see. What is real, at least from a scientific perspective, what is real, what is unchanging, what matter is, are not the objects in the world. Stone is not the crucial thing. The tree is not the crucial thing. What is crucial is the atomic and molecular structure. And modern science, in its lineal descent from Greek thinking, in that sense, says, yes, that is so. What is enduring, what is real, what is true, is not the objects we see in the world, but their underlying structure. Now, 20th century physics has upset us and rattled us by saying we're not quite sure about the atomic theory anymore. We're not quite sure we've got fundamental elements. And what's unnerving about being alive in the 20th century as compared to the 19th century is that the 19th century, at least from the point of view of physics, thought it had answered the Greek question. The 20th century is less confident of that we think the question's still open. But the point was, it's the Greek question and nobody else's question. And that was another way of looking at it. But again, at this point, we're just talking about people throwing out ideas. None of these becomes dominant in Greek thought at the time. People are speculating. What ties them together as a community of scholars is not their agreement on answers, but their agreement on the questions, which, by the way, is what really good science always is. A really good science is never a group of people who say, we've got all the answers, but really, we don't know a thing, but we know that we've got the right questions. And in a way, in this classic age of Greek science, that was the spirit that motivated their inquiry. So other ideas were tossed out. Empedocles tried another approach. He went back from the abstract to the natural, and building a little bit upon the atomists, tried what we would call a developmental theory, and said the important thing to know about reality is change itself. Now, that's a little hard to understand, but watch it, because when we get to Aristotle, we'll see this become the central proposition of Greek thought. And of course, as we go into the 19th and 20th century, into Darwin, into Marx and others, we see this same notion that what is the most essential reality is the process of development. To understand a thing, you have to see how it got to be what it is. To understand what it really is not to look at it as it exists today, but see how it got there. Now that's using development, or the principle of change, as a way of looking what is fundamentally true about something. Now, in our memory of our Western civilization, Empedocles rather starts this conversation, and Aristotle, as we'll see, quite shortly picks it up. But Empedocles' idea, being a good Greek, was that there were four basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Now, you've got to sort of picture the Greek landscape, a volcano, fire, a beautiful blue Mediterranean sea, water, the land, earth, and then the blue Mediterranean sky. And these seemed in the crisp air to be sharply distinguished things. And he thought that you could begin to make sense out of the world as a combination of these four properties. He's building on Thales, but he's saying Thales was too simple, trying to reduce it to one element. There are really four elements. And after all, to get gas out of water, we've got to combine it with fire. It is earth plus air plus water that creates plants, and so on. Well, that was another try. But one of the more sophisticated tries along this line, and one that had an enduring effect, especially through Plato, was the idea of mathematical form, and which we identify with the school of Pythagoras. And here, if you ask the question, and here it becomes very subtle. If you ask, what is true? What is steady? What is unchanging? No matter what the appearance of a thing is, the answer that the Pythagoreans gave was the mathematical character of it. A triangle is always the same. The formula for a triangle is always the same. Euclidean geometry, the propositions seem to be abstract but true. And beyond that, all of this was decay. It was in balance. Mathematical objects had a harmony to them, a proportion. The 5-4-3 formula of a triangle added up to something that looked beautiful, harmonious, in equilibrium, real. Now, the Pythagoreans began to say that's the fundamental thing. It's not a thing, it's an image, it's a form. And it can be captured in the human mind. It is the absolute underlying reality of all things, is mathematical expression. Now, if you're not catching that yet, remember that modern physics, modern economics, lots of modern disciplines believe that unless you can express a truth mathematically, you haven't got hold of it yet. That the world is mathematical, that God is a mathematician. The physicist in his heart of heart, even today, believes that he hasn't got the problem right if it isn't reduced to mathematical form. Now that's fascinating. See, back there is Pythagoras, then will come Plato, then will come the new Platonists, people like Copernicus, and even today, we mysteriously, almost mystically, hold on to that faith that the thing isn't true, our ideas aren't true unless they're capable of mathematical expression. And you can find that out if you go over to the econ department. You can find that out if you go over to the physics department. But what does it mean, underlying? Well, it means to some extent that we still believe that the underlying truth of a thing is mathematical, that what is permanent in a world of change. Now, the Pythagoreans experimented with this. They saw this possibility everywhere. They looked at music, and they found out that what made music work, what made it decay, what made it beautiful, was harmonics, and that those harmonics were mathematical. And they conjectured about astronomy, and they said, well, there's only one way in the world that the heavenly bodies can keep going around forever, and that's if they go around in a pattern which is perfect. And of course, a perfect eternal pattern is a perfect circle. Now, that idea that the planets revolve in perfect circles, of course, stuck with us for 2,000 years and kind of kept us from discovering a new astronomy. And we still retain the idea of eternity, the perfect circle, and the wedding ring, and many other memories of our race. But it's part of the speculation of the Pythagoreans, and it's part of their way of looking at the world. Of course, the Pythagoreans had a few problems, such as the problem of irrational numbers. When they found out that the square root of an equilateral triangle was an uneven number, they were very embarrassed by this, and in fact, they kept that secret. And one member of the Pythagorean sect who revealed that was accidentally drowned at sea, so they say. And in that, you get another sense of what's going on here, because these are schools, they are philosophies. You can think of them as groups and sciences. They're growing in the Greek area, but they're also like religions. They become sects. They become patterns of believers. The Pythagoreans they're talking about truth. They're talking about reality, but they're also talking about a faith. They're talking about an understanding, almost a secret mystical understanding of ultimate reality. And if you think of how that must have appeared to them, when they came upon this idea of mathematical form as underlying all reality and more permanent than it, and that in a sense it was a new idea. Nobody else had really said that before them. You can see why they had a sort of awesome feeling about their power. Now, when we come to Plato and the Republic, as we will next week, you're going to see a great relationship between Plato and the Pythagoreans, because Plato was strongly influenced by them. And in fact, a lot of the Pythagorean message comes down to our civilization through Plato. Well, there's one other group that's worth talking about in this context, and that's the Sophists. And they lead us to Socrates, and they lead us to Plato too. And the Sophists have come down to us with a bad name, thanks to Socrates and Plato. The Sophists, we talk about sophistry. And when we speak of sophistry, we think of false knowledge, untrue knowledge. Now, the Sophists were one of the schools of Greek thought, and they were the real antagonists of Plato and Socrates. For Plato, they were not the teachers of truth, but the teachers of getting ahead. In effect, what Plato blamed them of doing, what Socrates blamed them of doing, was of teaching people not what the truth was, what underlying reality was as opposed to illusion, but of teaching them how to speak well in the assemblies. They were teachers of rhetoric, many of them. And that for a fee, what they would do is to tell you how to get the attention of the president of the assembly and make a persuasive speech so as to stir your audience. In other words, they were law school professors or business school professors, you might say, in a certain way. And their angle was that they could teach you how to win friends and influence people, how to make a buck in the marketplace, to teach you practical knowledge. And in a way, as always has been the case down through time, they were scorned by real academics as just teaching practical things, but things that were illusion, you see. Because the way to make a good case in the forum was not necessary, it was contingent. The same way going to law school today is contingent. I mean, the laws that we have could be otherwise. And to learn the American laws that exist today is to learn an appearance. It's not to learn truth. Or to learn how to how to do accounting by conventional business practices is to learn a transitory and passing phenomenon. Now, these people took truth seriously. I mean, they were talking about underlying verities, and that the only true teaching was about these underlying things, and all teaching of practical wisdom was in the field of doxa, D-O-X-A, opinion, illusion, the things about the world of which we could not be sure. And the person who taught that was not a real teacher. Now, that's pretty strong talk. But that's on the grounds on which Socrates and Plato made their case against the Sophists. It's come down to us over time. But the Sophists, in a way, got a bad rap because they really were not just out to make a buck. They were not, in their most serious way, simply teachers of how to win friends and influence people. They, too, were part of this argument. In the context of Greek thought, they can be seen as the ancestors of modern relativism. A position, by the way, many of you either endorse without knowing it or have been taught to endorse. And we will even end the year with a reconsideration of it in the guise of American pragmatism, 20th century theories of relativity, and the rest of it. Protagoras, one of their great spokesmen, spoke for their view of this whole Greek problem of what was truth and illusion. And they turned the problem around and they said, wait a minute. Whatever is truth, underlying reality, underlying appearances, whatever is the real element underlying appearances, we can only know it partially. Because the apprehension of that truth depends upon the operation of the human mind. Now, to the extent that mathematical form, say, is the underlying reality, we can only know that insofar as the human mind can know mathematical form. So the Sophists were arguing, in a sense, that to assume that we can get the answer to the Greek question assumes that the human mind can apprehend the true nature of the universe, can apprehend the underlying laws of the universe. Now, if you can, then you can solve the problem. But their view, which by the way was later shared by Christians, skeptics, contemporary scientists, lots of other people, was that the human mind was not perfect, that the human mind could not record or reflect reality as it truly was, just as Christians believe that the human mind and spirit does not know God perfectly, just an image of God. And for that reason, the human mind is always sort of distant from reality. Now, for the Sophists, then, what was crucial about this fact was that that all knowledge, all theory, was in a sense human-made. So that people created the world because they created theories about the world. All of this speculation about what the ultimate reality might be was all very fine. But what it would lead to was what the human mind could comprehend about underlying reality. And insofar as the human mind could think mathematically, it could think about mathematics as underlying reality. But that might or might not be underlying reality. So all you were going to learn out of this whole operation of skeptical inquiry was something about the operation of the human mind. Man then became the measure of all things. The ultimate reality, in a strange way, was the theoretical capacity of the human mind. Now, Socrates and Plato did battle with the Sophists in the streets of Athens. And their legacy comes down to us in all the dialogues and finally in the Republic. And among their thoughts was this, and this is where Socrates begins to tease you, that if you ask the right questions, all right, you'll see the human mind at work. But it will begin to discover things that it didn't know were there. That hidden in the human mind, almost invisible to us, are things we can't account for. How does a child know about the symmetry of the triangle? How do we know harmony, proportion? How do we know that things are decay, that they have balance or proportion? These are just there. They're part of our memory. They're an exploration behind it. And in some invisible way, then, as Socrates through his dialogues, Plato after him, tried to draw out, the mind itself contains the secret of the universe. And that was their message against the Sophists.